and I had to go buy the groceries and write a check in her name. And the authority that let me do that was called a general power of attorney. And you see, if you push the arrow button forward, that there's an arrow that says it's active right away, and it ends at the point of incapability. So really, it's just a walking around document. When I came home, my grandmother would open up the grocery bags, would look at what I got, would look at the receipt, would look at how it all was, and she would query me about why eggs were so expensive and did I get the best price on the special for the steaks that day. She was a capable person, and she was able to provide oversight into it. And so generals of powers of attorney, I don't think I've seen it about 10 or 15 years. Let's move to the next slide. And if you push the matter forward, you'll see an arrow where it says continuing or enduring power of attorney. So this is a decision to make a document which is active right away and continues on past the point of incapability. Well, why would you ever want that? Why would you want somebody to be able to make a decision for you if you yourself were still capable of making that decision? Well, I am stuck right now in Israel, and I had planned on being in Banff. And if, for instance, my husband needed to do something for me, needed to manage my finances in any way, or needed to be able to make some type of a decision, needed to be able to sign a form with regards to our children on my behalf, he would be able to do so because he has a power of attorney which continues. It starts right away, and it allows him to make decisions while I'm there with my agreement. And then if I get hit by that big yellow bus, it allows to continue on past the point of incapacity. Hopefully that flight on the way home, if I ever do get on it, will not end up with me losing capacity. And the idea is, like my grandmother, I would be able to provide monitoring and overview while I'm still capable. And if he makes some kind of decision I don't like, I would have the ability to challenge that decision and try to undo it. So if he signs a form allowing our children to go bungee jumping and I say, actually, no, I can go back in and undo that decision. But it continues upon the point of incapacity. So again, in British Columbia and the Yukon, that would be called a representation agreement for the health and personal care decisions. And if it is in most of the rest of the different jurisdictions, it's going to be called a power of attorney for something to do with like a healthcare power of attorney. If it's for property, they're almost all called enduring or continuing powers of property. The next slide, if you move it forward, you'll see a little explosion that happens, and you'll see that it's dormant in the capable section and then springs into effect at the point of incapacity. So this is like that credit card that you get with the 1-800 number. It's dormant, it's sleeping until you call that number, and then you can activate that card. And this is for people who really want to make sure that nobody is trying to make decisions for them while they're still capable. So you have a greater certainty that nobody is meddling in your affairs while you're capable of doing it yourself. But at the same time, if I happen to go to Florida or travel somewhere else, nobody can step into my shoes and make decisions for me on an easy basis. And a lot of people do want that. One of the challenges with triggering or these springing powers of attorney is sometimes they're written so that it's Dr. Jones or Dr. Lee that will make the assessment of capacity. But Dr. Jones or Dr. Lee, she may have died or she may have retired years ago. So it's helpful to be very clear about who gets to make the decision about assessment of capacity, who gets to make the decision to spring it into effect. Is it a medical profession? Is it your sister? Is it your best friend? You have to actually write down who gets to spring it and how. But don't make it so difficult that it can't be sprung if needs be. You're probably already at a point of crisis. The fourth one, and I just make this note so that you know it exists, is called a limited power of attorney. And it's limited for a specific time or purpose. So for instance, if I was going away for 3 months on a sabbatical and I needed to have somebody take care of my household decisions with regards to things like paying property insurance or taxes and so on, I could have a kind of a power of attorney which would only allow either a particular kind of activity like renew my car insurance, or for a particular period of time. You can do all these things, but it's only from January to March, and then it will expire. So moving on to the next slide, who makes your personal care decisions if you're incapable? So imagine you've been hit by that big yellow bus. You're capable, you get to decide if you're on the good side of the street, you're hit by the bus, and then you move into the other side and you're now incapable. Well, like anything else, there's a ranking list. And so if you're a person that plays cards, for instance, if you are a person who plays something like bridge or any other type of a game like euchre that has a trump card, this is kind of the same thing. At the very top is something called a court-appointed guardian. In BC, it's still called a comity, which looks like the word committee, a comity of property or a comity of person. But really, it just means somebody that the court has made a guardian. It's very rare to get a guardian. It's particularly rare to get a guardian for anything to do with health and personal care. And I tell you, it's really difficult to get one without spending tens and tens of thousands of dollars. I would find it very difficult to go to court and get a guardianship with a lawyer for anything less than $30,000, $50,000. And quite often they can cost more than that if the matter is contested, if more than one person wants to apply for the position, or whether the person is contesting that they need a guardian or not. But in the end, that's the highest rank one. After that, it's what most people would try to have, which is a power of attorney. And this is, I'm going to use the domain of healthcare here, health and personal care. So some type of power of attorney for personal care. Again, with the proviso that in BC and the Yukon, it's called a representation agreement. And that's where you as a capable adult pick somebody else or a few other people together to make a decision for you. You have to do it while you're still capable. That's kind of the trick. A lot of the time people won't do it and the capacity is already starting to wander. And the question comes, do they now have the capacity to actually make a decision? And that's where the rub ends up. I put brackets around Consent Capacity Board because only in Ontario is there a tribunal system, which is informal and free, which will allow somebody to review whether a person is capable or incapable about making a decision, or if there's a conflict, somebody's not doing a good job, or there's concern around the decision maker being abusive or neglectful. You can go to the free Consent Capacity Board in Ontario alone, and only really to do with health and personal care decisions. And under that Ontario scheme, you're actually allowed to apply for something called Section 3 counsel. So the person can actually get a lawyer. The allegedly incapable person can have somebody who's there representing their own rights. But again, only in Ontario, hence the brackets. After that, there's a default list of kind of who you would expect. It goes to spouse, same sex, common law, that's fine. And then it goes down to adult children, to parents, to siblings and other relatives. Now, the lists are a little bit different in each jurisdiction. And one or two different jurisdictions still don't have a list, but most of them do. And it's important that you look at your substitute decision-making legislation to see who the list is in your province. Again, we have those resources for you so you can check per province who it is. In British Columbia, for instance, at the very end of the list is a close friend. In some other jurisdictions, really there isn't anyone except blood relatives involved. Moving to the next slide, and this is the one that usually gets people. If you're a capable person for finance, for property decisions, you get to decide. It's normal, it's what you'd expect. If you're hit by that big yellow bus, you become incapable. Same matter, a court-ordered guardian. Less rare than a court-ordered guardian for a personal healthcare decision, but still very rare. Only several thousand of them exist in each jurisdiction. And again, you run into the trouble of having to go to court, and you often run into the trouble of it being very expensive. Again, the second choice is a power of attorney for property. So that's where somebody will have made a decision in advance, made it in the format, formalized it in however that jurisdiction needs it formalized. Some jurisdictions, like our prairie provinces, often require a lawyer to formalize them. Quebec as well requires a notary or a lawyer, and even a more specific process in Quebec. In other jurisdictions, for instance, Ontario and British Columbia as an example, you don't need a lawyer. You can use the free online form, but for heaven's sakes, don't use the forms that you get at the Shoppers Drug Mart or the Rexall or whatever else. They're usually drawn up by Americans and are not legal in Canada. But you see, there's no default substitute decision maker. There's not the spouse and the adult child and so forth. And that's because you want to prevent self-dealing. So there is no jurisdiction in the country, not one, that has a default substitute decision-making list for health and for finance, pardon me. So people expect that there will be, but there is not. And it would end up in the hands of the public guardian and trustee in each jurisdiction, who are overwhelmed and do not want the work. And each public guardian trustee has slightly different jurisdictions. So some are more activists, like the Yukon and British Columbia, and some are more conservative. In Alberta, where we are right now, there is still what's kind of considered well, old-fashioned, I suppose, is the word I would use, in fact that they have still a separate public guardian, which is the institute and organization of our social service system that looks after only people, and a trustee who looks after only the stuff. So there's two different agencies and offices that are quite separate in some jurisdiction, but often they're being brought together. In almost every other jurisdiction, it's brought together. The next line that says, who is suitable, really, who do you appoint if you're going to choose to have an attorney? Or, you know, if you're looking at providing some support and help and advice to people about who's a good person to choose for an attorney and who isn't, I hope these slides will help. So you see suitability and availability, that's really important. So if you ask somebody and they're traveling all of the time with work, for instance, they might be stuck in, I don't know, Israel, then they may not be a suitable person to be your substitute decision maker. If they're a person that lives close by, that might help more. Although these days, with so many particularly financial applications that you can do from your phone, some of it, particularly with regards to the financial and property matters, might be able to be dealt with from a distance more easily. But health and personal care decisions, it's often more helpful to have somebody close up. Very often, people will expect family members to do this, and that's fine. But you shouldn't only think about family members. Maybe think about adult friends or people that you have that you care about and trust. When it comes to the financial matters, you really have to have somebody who's very detail-oriented, because they have to keep entirely separate accounts. So they have to run their money, and then they have to keep entirely separate accounts for your money. Many jurisdictions have the ability to appoint a monitor, somebody who can oversee it and has standing to challenge it and can ask more questions of the person who's been appointed, but not all jurisdictions do. And it's also important to have an alternate. So if, for instance, someone gets stuck traveling, that there's somebody else close by who can do it. You can appoint one person or two people or a number of people, but try to be clear about what happens if there's a tie. So if it's two people together, often two children, and they don't agree, what happens then? Is it both of them having to agree at the same time, or can whoever gets to the hospital bed first be good enough? So that's the difference between what's called joint, where they have to make the decision together, or several, where they get to make the decision independently. Sometimes people will have something that says if they can't agree, it'll go to a backup person. So as a result, alternates are every bit as important. I'm just gonna take this minute to point out that many people will be confused between the differences of having a power of attorney and having a will. I can't tell you, for the last 20 years, I think every talk I've ever given, someone has come up to me and said, oh, well, I have it taken care of. You know, we have our wills in place. And that's great. You should have your will in place. But wills only help you after you're dead. And so powers of attorney are the kinds of documents, or again, in BC and in the Yukon, representation agreements, and in Quebec, it's probably called a mandat, a mandate, although there are some powers of attorney which are much lesser documents there. But those are the documents you need when you're alive but incapable about making a decision. And when you're making a determination about whether a person has capacity, you always have to say capacity to do what? Capacity is always presumed in law, and it's supposed to be narrowly sliced. So you can be capable, for instance, of making health and personal care decisions and capable of making routine financial decisions, but you may not be capable about doing, for instance, a merger and acquisition or some type of managing of your investments. So you're always trying to make sure that we reduce the implications or the impacts on a person's capacity, because you're really removing their civil rights. So it says who to select for a power of attorney. Well, it's going to have to be somebody pretty scrupulous, someone who's going to respect your wishes. They have to do the thing that you would have wanted them to do, not what they think is in your best interests. So they literally slip on their mental shoes and become you. So for instance, if you're a person who is against, for instance, blood donation, and the person who you're making a decision